Okay, great. So thank you so much. Thank you for all of you joining this evening. We're going to start off. We're going to have a look today at the origins and history of Kabbalistic thought, and then along the way, kind of explore and discuss some of these like broader themes that we have been talking about and how they relate to the 10 Sephirot that we've been discussing, and then beyond. Some of the issues, some of the things maybe we'll talk about today, we're going to explore and discuss Jewish view. One of the pieces we're going to talk about today is reincarnation, right? How Kabbalah and reincarnation kind of fit in together, and how interestingly the concept of reincarnation is actually essentially pretty much accepted within Jewish thought. So we'll have a look at that today, reincarnation, and see where that comes from in Judaism and how that manifests itself. I suppose beyond, in addition to that, I think I spoke about last time. I spoke about with you last time about like the soul. That probably relates. I think I spoke about that. I think that was with you guys. If not, I'll like reiterate some pieces to do with that. And we'll also take a look. And we'll explore if Kabbalah provides an insight into the way that we understand the God, the way we understand the world, the way we understand ourselves. Why is it typically kind of cut off from us? Why is it something which, if we are young, interested, enthusiastic, minds, individuals, why is it that Kabbalah maybe is kind of closed away? And there are different reasons for that, not only in terms of the content of Kabbalah itself, but actually mainly historically. Okay, some of the issues of Kabbalistic study, particularly within the Jewish world and the Jewish community, which we'll look at today. So I'm going to bring you over to my screen. Again, please do jump in with any questions that you may have at any point, and I'll stop off at certain points during the presentation. So let's have a look. So we're going to look at today how Kabbalah itself kind of flows through the history of the Jewish people. And just to quickly recap, to kind of see where we were last time. The first three sessions we've kind of looked at the foundations of Kabbalistic thought, and the foundations of Kabbalistic thought begin with the concept of Ein Sof, begin with the concept of connecting to and trying and believing in some kind of infinite, all-powerful being, which in English might be referred to as God. In Hebrew, there are only 70 names that we call God by, but in Kabbalah, that initial concept of an infinite being that is almost impossible for us to understand is Ein Sof. But in any event, it's our duty as human beings to try as much as we can to connect to Ein Sof. And then we looked at how there are different Kabbalistic ideas of how Ein Sof isn't just this outside force called God, but perhaps there is a unity going on here, that in fact, that according to Kabbalah and many Kabbalistic teachings, that the Ein Sof is not only God, but also the whole entire universe and us too. And so we then moved a step further, and we began to take a look and see how something called the 10 Sephirot are a way for us not only to understand God and to connect to God, but also a way for us to understand ourselves and to understand the universe and to understand our world. And that boiled down, everything in existence can be classified and connected to the 10 Sephirot. And we had a look at the first three that revolved around planning, revolved around, if we're looking from the perspective of God, how there was a broad, wide intentionality to the creation of the universe, each expressed in these first three, Keter, Chokhmah, and Binah. Also within the human mind, we could also see how the human mind works with these three, Chokhmah being this intuitive subconscious spark that happens in our mind, and binah, the insight and understanding that we take that inspiration and are able to verbalize it and express something because of it. Then the next level down, we then had a look at the three beneath. How, if we're talking about the 10 Sephirot as God, how God manifests himself or itself within the universe with a duality of not only justice, judgment, strength, strict law, on the other hand, with a loving kindness and mercy. Those two pieces complement one another and come together, and to create a concept of Tiferet, which links together everything within the 10 Sephirot. We then also see that within ourselves, how we also have different aspects that make different personality traits and actions that make up who we are. We revolve, and we sometimes like to see the world and see ourselves as fair and just, and sometimes we see ourselves as going above and beyond, trying our utmost to show love to all those around us. And again, within our lives, within our relationships, we try and combine all of those things together. And as a way of life, right, as a way of life, many Kabbalists will use at least these, the entire 10 Sephirot, but those three in particular, to navigate the world and to navigate their actions. There is a time for us to be just. There's a time for us to be strict. There's a time for us to call for right, as we're saying right now, to call for fairness and equality. And there is a time when we need to kind of go that extra step, go that extra mile, and go beyond what is quote unquote fair, in order to kind of make the world a better place. So that's kind of what we've been looking at now. We're going to take a quick break, right? The last four that we will get to relate to kind of looking to the future, right? We're going to be discussing concepts of the Messiah. We're going to be discussing concepts about the Jewish conceptions and Kabbalistic conceptions of the end of the world, and Jewish and Kabbalistic conceptions about death and the afterlife. And those four here, they kind of relate to that. As a sequitur, as like a kind of a piece in between, I wanted to kind of just take a step back to take a look at like a brief history of where these ideas have come from, who the key players are, what they taught, what they believed, as a springboard for us to continue discussing other Kabbalistic, practical Kabbalah, other practical Kabbalistic ideas. Now, from before I even continue, questions, thoughts, concerns, should I clarify anything that's come up so far at all? As I've said, whether it relates to stuff we've covered in the past and other sessions, anything at all? Whilst I take a sip of coffee. Sip has been taken. Let's continue. So many of you probably are familiar with the most famous book of Kabbalah called the Zohar. Now, according to traditional Jewish belief, it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the year 100 CE. There's like a very interesting and kind of fascinating story that I think I've mentioned to you before that goes along with this, that again, you may be familiar with. It was after the destruction of the Second Temple. There were still Jews living in Israel, right, at that time. And they were allowed to go and study in certain places. But as the Romans tried to kind of squeeze out Jewish culture in Israel at that time and force Jews to leave Israel or then Palestine to go elsewhere, Torah study became forbidden. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the leading rabbis at the time, fled, and he went and he found a cave, and he sat and he studied in this cave non-stop with his son for 7 years. And according to the story, which is told in the Talmud, Tractate of Shabbat, page 33, side B, it describes how he sits in this cave for 7 years, and during these 7 years, he reveals the mystic teachings known as the Merkava. Okay, the Merkava. The Merkava appears throughout the Talmud and other Jewish books is like this general term for what we call Kabbalah, what we now refer to as Kabbalah. Okay, and again, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit sidetracked. I'll bring this all together, I promise. The Merkava is a word that is found, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place. I hope you stay with me. Right, we're talking about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He's sitting in this cave. He's studying the inner secrets of the world. Okay, the inner secrets of the world are called the Merkava. I'll come back to that in a second. He then leaves the cave, having been isolated from his peers for many, many, many years, and he cannot fathom why anyone would ever sin or do anything wrong ever. And the Talmud states that when he sees someone not keeping Shabbat, he looks at them and they burst into flames. There's a commentary there that says he actually grew his eyebrows to be extra long so he could block this vision of this laser Superman vision that made people burst into flames whenever they were doing a sin. And a voice from heaven comes and says, you haven't been in the cave long enough, you must go back. And so he goes back and he sits in the cave for another 7 years and he continues studying. And then he comes out a more enlightened, more down to earth and practical human being. And the story, as the story goes, that the tradition goes that during that time, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai revealed the mystical secrets of the world and wrote them down in a book called the Zohar, which means the Book of Splendor. Now, these mystical teachings weren't invented by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but they were something which had already been passed down, which we'll get to a bit later, called the Merkava. So, the Merkava. The Merkava literally means vehicle. In the story of Elijah, the story of Elijah in Kings 1, also a pretty famous story, famous because I know it, is that Elijah doesn't die in the text, but he ascends to heaven in a fiery chariot. And the word used in that text is Merkava. Interestingly enough, if anyone's a Hebrew nerd, the Merkava is also a modern Hebrew word. Anyone know what is Merkava in modern Hebrew? Well, it's like it's kind of a brand of something. Anyone know Merkava? Merkava is what Israelis, is the brand of tanks they use in the Israeli army. So it's like Merkava Mark II, Merkava Mark III. So it's like pretty interesting, right? Tanakh, Bible, fiery chariot, tank, kind of a chariot that's fire, whatever. Anyway, Merkava is this kind of ancient mystical teaching that has like always been around. Now, from a like purely academic historical perspective, right? I mentioned before, I'm a classically modern Orthodox rabbi, but I'm also a pluralistic rabbi. So that's that narrative. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that's a Orthodox narrative. From a historical perspective, what has been proven by historians is that the first individual who we can prove wrote and spoke about the Zohar was a rabbi called Rabbi Moshe de Leon, a Spanish rabbi who published the Zohar. He was the individual who first claimed it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In the Talmud, it just talks about how he, studied and he revealed these secrets. But this book, the Zohar, was first kind of published by this Rav Moshe de Leon, whatever. Okay. And over that time, from the late 13th century, is when Kabbalistic teachings, mystical teachings, begin to take off. Okay. More predominantly in the Sephardic world, right, in Spain, then moving over into Egypt and then into Israel, and a lesser extent in the Ashkenazi world, in Europe, but then there'll be a crossover, we'll get there. Other rabbis who also develop Kabbalistic thought, and many of the things that we are learning come from these individuals. So Moshe Cordova of Tzvat, and he was the one who kind of brought a lot of this kind of very spread out Kabbalistic teachings and put it into a more coherent system, writing a number of different books that we've used before, like the Sefer HaBahir and other pieces like that. Again, the Ramak, so this Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, is also the one who kind of consolidated these ideas of the 10 Sephirot. And then most famously, one of the most famous Kabbalistic rabbis, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, known as also as the Ari, or the Arizal, who also lived in Sfat. So if you've been to Sfat, if you ever go to Sfat, minimally, right, you go to the candle factory and you go to the Arizal's like synagogue, like at least those two, and then probably some other things, but it's those two, candle factory and Arizal. So he was the one who also kind of developed a number of different ideas in Kabbalah, which we'll begin to explore. Predominantly, which we're going to talk about now, the Arizal is the one who pushed the study of reincarnation in Judaism. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this right now. This is if you want to read in your own time. I don't want to just sit here and kind of read out to you. I am kind of just lecturing at you, but please jump in with any questions at any point. I would love that very much. But the Arizal lived in Tzfat. He only lived to the age of 38. It's quite common, unfortunately, interestingly, fascinatingly, more morbidly, that a number of famous Kabbalists die at a kind of early age. Even at that time, 38 was pretty young. And other examples, the Rivak died very, very young. Of Aryeh Kaplan, another famous Kabbalist, died when he was 40. And actually, we might actually touch upon that a bit later when we get to a piece of the Talmud. But one of the famous pieces that he talks about is reincarnation. Okay, in a book called Shar HaGilgulim, which was written by one of his students called Rav Chaim Vital. And let me go into this I'll go into what, in like an intro, what he says in terms of what Judaism teaches about reincarnation. But it's interesting to note that the concept of reincarnation in Judaism isn't necessarily rejected by anyone. He writes the following thing, that as we have learnt, or we have seen, every human being, according to Jewish teaching, has a soul. Now, classically, the way that we might interpret that, and we have been taught that before, is that when an individual is born, they get a soul. That soul stays with them. You, as a human being, the vehicle, the body, feeds the soul by performing good deeds, by performing mitzvot. Those mitzvot, those good deeds, are informed by the Torah and its interpretations. And the more mitzvot you do, the closer you come to God, and the more your soul becomes empowered. And then when you pass away, your soul then ascends and goes to Olam Haba, goes to heaven. Pirkei Avot says, interestingly, two different things. Number one, that Kol Yisrael yesh chelek ba'olam haba, every single individual, even if you were born and you sit and you do nothing your entire life, you just sit like a potato and do nothing. I don't know why that's a phrase, but anyway, you sit and do nothing, your soul still goes to Olam Haba, it still goes to heaven. There's no concept in Judaism that you're damned to hell by not performing certain deeds. Every single person, just by mere fact of being alive, goes to heaven. Where you place, how much you get into Olam Haba, that's dependent on actions. Yes, question.
What's the concept of Gehenna then in Judaism? Because you said that there's no hell, but my understanding is that there's sort of this Gehenna, which is sort of hell or purgatory. What's the role of that?
Okay, fabulous. Okay, excellent question. So the answer I'm going to give you now comes from Aryeh Kaplan. He says the following: that the Jewish concept of hell is different to how we'd understand from, let's say, Christian theology. They work something like this: that when an individual passes away, their soul leaves the body. The soul then enters a state of shock as it's in its new state, distinct, different from the body. And then it goes to what you refer to either as Gehenna, another word for it is Sheol, or it's more similar to the concept of purgatory. What that means is that the soul then essentially watches back its entire lifespan with that individual, which in and of itself, according to the Talmudic text, is a kind of form of punishment. Right? Not necessarily the fire and brimstone, but the embarrassment and shame that's felt of the opportunities missed and the mistakes made is the purifying process that the soul goes through. Okay? Right, like if someone were to follow you 24 hours with a video camera, no escape, I mean, some people might like that. We've seen that in like reality TV shows, but most of us, we then had to sit down and watch that back. That'd be hugely embarrassing. So if you play that back for your whole life in front of God or whatever, that's the concept. So that's like the Jewish, that's how Kabbalists at least see Gehenna. There is also a discussion in the Gemara as to perhaps Gehenna, there is an aspect of kind of fire involved. There is. The Talmud ends this discussion by saying, "Ayin lo ra'ata." Look, we don't know. There's no eyes have seen it. That's ayin lo ra'ata. No eyes have seen it, so we don't necessarily know. But especially today, right, in terms of Jewish, like within the Kabbalistic world, but even in mainstream Jewish world, that's the concept that's held up. Now, moving on from that, there are also individuals who wouldn't necessarily move on from that stage because of what they've done in their life. With a vast majority, even someone who, according to, let's say, like mainstream classic Jewish interpretation, isn't a quote unquote good Jew, would still go to Olam Haba, would still go to heaven. The Gemara says that the equivalent time the soul goes through this purgatory is the equivalent of maximum 12 months. That the worst of the worst, someone who was just not a great person, would be there for 12 months. It's the reason why that an individual, if you're saying Kaddish after a parent passes away, you say Kaddish for 11 months, a maximum 11 months. Now the reason for that is that the reason for saying Kaddish is to elevate the soul, to get a better place in Olam Haba. But we only say it for 11 months and not 12, because we don't want to kind of admit, or we don't want to kind of suggest that individual is deserving of 12 months of purgatory. So we just say it for 11 months. Now the piece here that the Arizal introduces is that actually that's not the end. The way that we understand the soul is that it goes round, it's cyclical. Okay? Gilgul in Hebrew is like circle. And what happens is that a soul needs to attain a certain level before it can go to Olam Haba. And if it hasn't necessarily attained that level in one lifetime, it will recycle and enter into someone else. And he talks about how, he talks about how there are 49 levels the soul needs to ascend, similar to, he says, the 49 days from when the Jewish people left Egypt to when they arrived at Mount Sinai, the same as the 49 days from the festival of Passover to the festival of Shavuot, which is also the Sephirot HaOmer. So too are the 49 cycles, or 49 cycles, or levels that a soul needs to go through in order to reach Olam Haba. Now, on a basic level, it's not really necessarily disputed that that's a Jewish belief, right? And these things prove or whatever, but it's a Jewish belief. The question is whether or not a soul is able to connect to or have some kind of memory of its previous life. There are some like stories and examples. There's a famous story called Dibuk, which was turned into a play and also into a novel. It's actually based on a true story that took place in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century that involved the Chafetz Chaim, also a famous rabbi, with a Jewish girl who started behaving very oddly. She was starting saying things that she couldn't have known, and she was talking about this other person's life, this like old man who had passed away, whatever. And like it turned out that she had like her soul, like a previous life of her soul was speaking out. And the Chafetz Chaim and this other rabbi, this Rav Lopian, go and they perform this kind of Jewish exorcism. It's really interesting, something we don't necessarily hear about so much in Jewish literature. I'd recommend going to look it up. Again, these stories exist, whether or not you believe in it or don't believe in it. In any event, it's interesting on a basic level. So that's the piece. And he introduced the idea of reincarnation. And there are other we come back to it later in terms of the way that we behave and what we do within our lives. There's a piece here, right? The origins of kind of Jewish Kabbalah appear in Exodus. Very, very briefly, to when Moses is speaking to God. God comes to Moses and says the following. He says, hold on one second, pointer, here we go. He says, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. And from that one verse, the concept that there is a face, there is a way to see God, there is more than we understand. This verse itself became the catalyst for a discussion on how we understand God. It was a discussion between the Rambam, Maimonides, and another rabbi called the Malbim. And the Rambam, who was he wasn't anti-mysticism, but the Rambam was famously a very practical, logical philosopher, who essentially said that when we talk about physical traits of God, we're not talking about, it's not that God has emotions, but God has just actions. There are deeds. And the way that we understand God is not through anything physical whatsoever, just through the way that God interacts with us. And to take the case even further, he said, again, this quote here is from the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, okay, his foundational philosophical work. He then goes on to state as well that there's no like concept of unity, right? Ein Sof, he completely dismisses. The Rambam goes on to say there is no corporeal unity, there is no dividing of parts or components, right? 10 Sephirot, but God is one, Zeo, that's it. However, there are other commentators who came along who disagreed with the Rambam's practical, non-mystical approach. One of them was called the Malbim, who quotes a verse from Ezekiel saying that actually Kabbalah, these mystical teachings, are in bed within Jewish literacy, Jewish literature. For example, he gives a quote from Ezekiel, found in the Bible, from the Tanakh. It says as follows: "As the image of a rainbow in the cloud on a rainy day, so the image of the glow surrounding it, it is the image of God's majesty." There is something within the physical world that isn't, we're not looking at God, that it is a way, there is a method to connect to God that isn't hidden. And that's essentially what becomes Kabbalah. Another example, the very first chapter of Ezekiel, he describes this almost physical presence of God. An example here, a stormy wind came sweeping out, a huge cloud with flashing fire surrounded by a radiance. In the center of it, in the center of the fire, a gleam as of amber, which many Kabbalists subsequently then kind of compared this description in Ezekiel to the 10 Sephirot, right? If we're talking about surrounded by a radiance, we spoke about kind of Keter and the radiance, but also this idea of Tiferet, the idea of beauty, sitting in the middle over there. And so initially, again, the mystical backdrop or background to the world wasn't accepted by everyone. However, it was something which has always existed. Now here I need to change this a second to make it easier to read. This is another example, okay, of how Kabbalah has existed in Judaism for a while. To make it a bit easier to read, hold on, let's make it a bit easier to read because it's all bunched up for some reason. A really wonderful piece of Gemara, and again, it begins to give an insight as to why Kabbalah was kind of shunned, let's say, within the Jewish world. Okay, just going to read it like this because, okay, I'm just going to get rid of that and move that up. And we'll talk about what I'm doing whilst I'm doing it, so it doesn't get awkward, even though this is awkward because I'm still talking about what I'm doing. Okay, let's have a look at this. Okay, wonderful. This piece of Talmud appears in Chagiga, and it talks about 4 rabbis who enter into deep Kabbalistic, well, it doesn't use the word Kabbalah, but deep mystical study. Okay, the 4 rabbis are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. And they're all kind of, sitting there, having a great time, talking about Jewish mysticism, talking about the deeper inner meaning of everything around us. And Rabbi Akiva, the most learned rabbi among them, says the following: when upon your arrival, when you go to the upper worlds, whatever that means, let's say it could be Olam Haba, heaven, whatever, and you reach the pure marble stone, do not say Mayim, Mayim. Do not look at this world and say water, water, although it might look like water. Why? Because it says in this verse in Psalms, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before my eyes. He who lies will not be able to enter into heaven. And at that point, according to the story in the Talmud, after Rabbi Akiva gave this very weird, esoteric, unclear, super vague teaching, the rabbi Ben Azai saw God, saw the divine presence, and instantly died. Ben Zoma saw the divine presence and completely lost his mind. Acher, or this Elisha ben Avuya, chopped down the shoots of saplings. In other words, he became a complete and utter, he became a heretic. He couldn't cope, he's completely lost his Jewish identity. And Rabbi Akiva was absolutely fine. Now, this piece of Talmud is probably the clearest example we have of like rabbis pre like Middle Ages studying Kabbalah and the dangers of doing so at a deep level. Now, there are lots of interpretations as to what this story means. I'll give you a quick insight as to like what's the water, mayim, the significance of water. Hopefully no one will go crazy if we talk about this a bit more, but I'm sure we'll be fine. But the idea is that part and parcel of Jewish learning throughout Jewish history, there is this esoteric, there is this mystical learning that can be accessed and obviously should be accessed in a certain way. And that according to Jewish teachings, there are dangers to it. Now, either it's, again, there are different outcomes here. Some would say Ben Azai, the idea that he passed away, perhaps according to some interpretations, was a positive, right? That he understood the purpose of life. His soul had reached the 50th step and then just went. Ben Zoma, he was close enough, but he went crazy. This idea, he became a heretic, again, also makes sense. That when we deal with Kabbalistic ideas, there is a lot there that can kind of be confused with idolatry and other pieces which Jews are not allowed to kind of believe in necessarily. And Rabbi Akiva was a G and he came out fine. The idea is, we'll have a quick look at the waters over here. Another Kabbalistic interpretation, which refers to the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden are not a synonym in Judaism for heaven, Gan Eden. And in the Bible, in Bereshit, it explains how there were 4 rivers that led into the Garden of Eden. And that perhaps could be the topic that Rabbi Akiva was talking about. He was teaching them the way to the Garden of Eden, teaching them how to find heaven, how to get there. According to this is the Akedat Yitzchak, a Kabbalistic commentary on the Bible. And in this commentary, he explains how, again, there were 4 rivers that came from the Garden of Eden. Each one is a way for us to understand the world. The first one, Pishon, is the urge to understand why, wherefore, where. The next river that flows into and out from the Garden of Eden is Gichon, which symbolizes understanding the earth, farming, agriculture. The third is Chidekel, which represents the ability to reason, logical reasoning. And the fourth is Prat, or the Euphrates, is the force that enables theological reasoning and philosophy. And according to Akedat Yitzchak, according to Rabbi Akiva, these four ways are the ways that we think about our world, the way that we interact with our world. And that he says, when you get to heaven, when you get to the Garden of Eden, you must look at the entire picture. You can't just look at the water. You can't just look to what's flowing into the Garden of Eden. This way of understanding, you need to see the goal at the end. That each four of these are just a means. They're just a way for us to interact with the world. What's important is the end goal, at least here, it's the end. And so when you get to heaven, be happy that you've made it there, rather than like the road leading up. Right, and that was the teaching that either causes a person to die, causes a person to go crazy, to become a heretic, or that he was fine, according to the Akedat Yitzchak. There's other pieces here which we'll talk about. You can talk about at a different time. I'm happy to take questions later after. Like, so what do these four these rivers represent? Why these four rivers? Do we know where they are today? We know where the Euphrates is. Why does each one relate to each? But that's a discussion for a different time. So that's one reason. Okay, that's one reason why Kabbalah was was shunned, because of the gravity that was given within the Talmud. And again, when we're doing this course, again, we're not necessarily sitting and learning through page after page of the Zohar, but we're learning these concepts. Another one is historical. Again, another famous story of Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi were, again, this is where we talk about Eastern Europe more. Shabtai Tzvi, born in 1626, Talmudic scholar, charismatic, but also a devoted Kabbalist. And he began to kind of dabble and delve into practical Kabbalistic practices. Something that he did, which was controversial, but also interesting, which is he amassed some followings, and he invited his followers to a wedding. He said he was getting married. They arrived at the wedding, and at his wedding, it was actually him under a chuppah marrying a Torah scroll. Now, again, in terms of there is, like, again, this is not something which is done in Judaism or even in Kabbalah. However, there are a lot. It's common to see imagery within the Torah that compares the Jewish people to a bride and God to a groom. Also, the Torah to some extent to a bride, and he performed this ceremony as a way to kind of stake his claim as the Messiah. He even went around trying to appoint 12 some apostles, followers to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And one has to understand, and I hear again, you can read this in your own time, that at the time in Europe, and this was taken from a primary source, taken from this a Jewish woman who lived in Germany in the 17th century, that the Jewish community was in a very, very difficult place for a number of different reasons. The hardest was the amount of persecution and pogroms that were going on. This took place very close to the Khmelnytsky massacre. Okay, the largest killing of Jewish people since the expulsion from Israel with the Romans in the year 70. And the only kind of mass pogrom that topped the Khmelnytsky massacre was the Holocaust around 200 years later. So the Jewish community was reeling, and it was looking out for someone to save them. So along comes this guy who says he can he's the Messiah. He performs these very kind of out there Kabbalistic traditions, and he amasses a serious following. Now all this comes to a head when he is captured by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he's given a choice to either convert to Islam or give up his life, and he chooses to convert. at which point his followers kind of just disperse. And of course, again, it has this huge knock-on effect on the Jewish world, particularly in Europe. This guy who was claiming to be the Messiah abandons his community, abandons his followers. At which point, two of the leading rabbis in Amsterdam, you can see over here, Rav Tzvi Ashkenazi and Chacham Tzvi, Rav Yaakov Emden, essentially ban the study of Kabbalah. They blame the study of Kabbalah on the happening of Shabtai Tzvi. And there are multiple book burnings that take place in Europe of Kabbalistic ideas. And it isn't really until around 100 years later or so, until the study of Kabbalah begins to re-emerge in two different ways. Number one is Rabbi Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who writes a number of different books. And one of his most famous, which again touches upon the concept of reincarnation, particularly and how the soul kind of evolves and adapts through each cycle. And he talks in his book, the Mesilat Yesharim, how we as an individual can help our soul progress and grow through its lifetime, right? Specifically what actions we can do. I'd highly recommend that book, Path of the Just. Maybe we'll look at it. We'll look at it maybe in a couple of weeks. Also, the Hasidic movement, the Hasidut movement, started by the Baal Shem Tov, that then kind of has a huge explosion in the 18th century, in the 19th century, also heavily influenced by Kabbalah, but also causes tension within the Jewish community. A huge split takes place. That split has now basically been rectified, but Hasidut, which is the focus on worshiping God through song and dance and physical service, rather than just through study, rather than just through intense prayer, was heavily influenced by Kabbalah, I'm going to take a bit. We're coming kind of towards the end. I'm going to kind of just. I'll tell you what. I'll finish off now briefly. I just want to take a look at just one lesson from the Zohar, perhaps one thing on the Arizal. Then I'll stop talking, and I'll give some time for like questions and discussions and your own thoughts on anything that I've said today. Just a very brief thing from the Zohar. The Zohar is a commentary on the Zohar, ostensibly as a commentary on the Torah. For those, there was a course on like the Jewish books given by Masa. The Zohar is a commentary written in Aramaic. So just to give you one example of a teaching that's found in the Zohar, to give you a bit of a taste of the Zohar, which is this: that in the Torah, God says the following. God says the following. So if you follow God's laws, you follow his mitzvot, you follow the commandments, then you'll be rewarded. If you don't, then God will set his face against his people and he will discipline them sevenfold for your sins, and he will scatter you among the nations. If you do not listen to God, you will be scattered all over the world, which was manifested in Jewish history. The Zohar comes along and gives an analogy. The Zohar asks the question, how could it be, right? How could God abandon his people? How could God just let them go? The Zohar gives a parable. It says as follows: there was a king who had a son who kept on misbehaving, and one day the son really offended the king. The king turns to his son and says, I've punished you too many times, and you have still not changed. What should I do with you? I'm going to banish you from this land, from this kingdom, and perhaps the wild beasts and wolves and robbers will deal with you. What else can I do? And so too with this verse in Vayikra, God says to the Jewish people, what else can I do with you? When you were in the land of Israel, you didn't listen to anything that I said, so therefore I've got to send you out. I've got to send you out to be persecuted. I've got to send you out so you can learn your lesson. However, the Zohar writes, if I expel you from the land alone, I fear that packs of wolves and bears will attack you and you will be no more. So what would I do? The only solution is that I and you together leave the land and both of us go into exile. Now, just some interesting points to kind of pick out and to touch upon here is, number one, the Zohar's desire to explain Jewish history in the context of prophecy. Right, so it's taking this prophecy in Vayikra and explaining it within the context of what's going on in the world at the time. Number two, how God is still is laying the claim that God is still very much involved in Jewish history. And what you will find, on many occasions is the Kabbalistic compulsion to explain Jewish history through a divine lens. Now that both has, for us looking at ancient history, that's interesting, that's fascinating. But what you'll also find is Kabbalists will take a head-on approach when dealing with more raw, recent events in our history, particularly the Holocaust, particularly issues as they relate to the state of Israel. Now again, there are multiple different voices. Not one person represents Judaism. Not one person represents Kabbalah. But what you'll find, particularly as based like the Kabbalistic teachings in the Zohar, is there is nothing that's taken place in Jewish history that has been outside the hand of God. Nothing. Now take that as you will. There are plenty of Jewish philosophers that think differently, but Kabbalah, based on this piece here, it explicates everything that happens, even that's happening now, is in some way is through the hand of God. And in some cases, again, some will even take it further and will say that it's even preordained. Okay, there's a Kabbalistic approach, something called the Bible codes, which some of you may have heard of before, in which there's understanding that events that have taken place and then will take place have all been predicted within the text and the letters of the Bible itself. If you were to take certain words and skip out certain letters in a certain pattern, you can predict, not only think that we can see the Torah has predicted certain things and will predict certain things. Again, take that as you will, as much as you want. Just to kind of finish off one more piece, just from the Arizal, another piece, just to kind of like a nice way to end off. And then I'll hand it over to you guys, which is the following, just to come back to this idea of the Arizal. In most, everyone's opinion, the formative Kabbalistic teacher, the way the majority of the Kabbalah that we are teaching and learning today comes from the teachings of the Arizal. I just want to focus on this piece here. It kind of relates to what I've said already. He focuses on he talks about the different aspects of the soul: the nefesh, ruach, neshama, and chaya. There are different levels to the soul that we have. Some aspects of our soul we share with other living beings. Okay, chaya. We share, other way around. Nefesh and chaya, we share with animals, the idea of a life force, the idea of like the animalism that we have each within us. What separates us out from animals is ruach and neshama, the idea of a spirit, of an intellectual spirit that we have within us, and an aspect of godliness that we have within us. A tiny spark of godliness, he says. And the sheath in which it is closed is a created being, albeit a spiritual being and not physical. As the soul emanates from Ein Sof, eventually to be clothed in a physical form, body, the soul, descends. We are, I'm not reading from here, we are Tiferet. We are the culmination of a spiritual and physical side. And it's our role in this world to take the physical objects around us, every physical object around us, and to imbue it with purpose, to imbue it with meaning, to imbue it with spirituality. Right? That's our goal, that's our mission. Right? When I take a piece of food and I concentrate on that piece of food and maybe I say a blessing, or maybe I just concentrate on how thankful I am that I'm able to eat this fruit. and the process that goes through to making a piece of fruit, from nothingness to somethingness. When I meditate on that, I am taking something purely physical and I am imbuing it with meaning. When I wear clothes, when I give charity, when I sit and I eat with my family and I make a blessing over bread, and I'm conscious of the process that's gone into making that bread. Or I could go on for hours and hours and hours, but you get the idea. I'll stop, I promise I'll stop. You get the idea. That's our role. That's how our soul and our body interact and are entangled. And he says, the soul enclosed in the body is a reflection of the divine form called Tselem Elokim, that every single individual, every single human being is created in the image of God and has a soul that is able to connect to the spiritual world. Again, this is a question that was asked in Sunday's session. Again, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish, and this we can discuss at a different point, a different time if you wish, or even now. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish. Every single individual is created with Tselem Elokim and has a nefesh, ruach, neshama, and chaya, has this aspect within them. This more derives from the configuration of the Sephirot. This body that we have is configured according to the 10 Sephirot. The Sephirot which we began studying the last 2 weeks, which form the structure of the worlds through which the soul descends in its journey down into the body. The way that we interact with our soul, the way that we interact with our world, the way that we interact with God is found through the 10 Sephirot. And that is, in a nutshell, one of the most important teachings of the Arizal, what he gave us in terms of Kabbalah. What we'll do is next time we've kind of looked at the past a bit, how some of the key teachers of Kabbalah, how Kabbalistic teachings have developed in some kind of way. We'll begin now to look at what Kabbalah says about the future, about the end of days, about the Messiah, about our role within the world. Does anyone have, questions, comments, thoughts, follow-ups, anything? Yes, Ella.
So you were saying that, so there was something happened in Amsterdam, right? So a lot of Jewish philosophers were there and kind of banned, right? That's what because I was a member of the same synagogue Maimonides was a member of.
That's pretty awesome.
You were talking about this.
Yeah. Can
you maybe place this a bit more with what happened and with the Kabbalistic views and how, I guess, it wasn't accepted?
Okay. So in terms of there's two different dates. Okay. We're talking about the Rambam. The Rambam didn't live at a time. The Rambam lived from 1130, would live in the 12th century. He lived from 1135 to 1204. This was kind of let's say they call it the Kabbalistic Revolution, which took place about 100 years later. The Rambam still, though, was against kind of a anthropomorphic description, like describing God in physical forms or saying that we can connect to God in any kind of way, but again, in a physical way. And so he didn't necessarily come out against anyone particularly at his time in terms of Kabbalah, but his teachings have come to inform the debate. When we're talking about Amsterdam, we're talking about the teaching, the viewpoint of Rav Yaakov Emden. Okay, so with this we're talking about towards the end of the 17th century, and there's a split within the community. Now, at that point, the predominant Kabbalistic teachings were in the Spanish and Portuguese communities. Now, they continued to thrive after the Shabtai Tzvi affair. Now, what happened is that there is obviously still a prominent Spanish and Portuguese community in Holland, in Amsterdam. So there were splits. There was a split within the community. Those from more of a Germanic, Lithuanian background or connection rejected Kabbalistic teachings because of the Shabtai Tzvi and under the recommendation of Rav Yaakov Emden and others. and those who were part of Spanish and Portuguese continued that tradition for a couple of different reasons, mainly because they were less affected by the Shabtai Tzvi saga, but also it was a bigger part of the Sephardic culture. It always had been, right? The Kabbalah, like more modern Kabbalistic teachings, emerged in Spain and developed in Spain, then went also to Morocco, found their way into some parts of Europe. It didn't return. Kabbalistic teachings didn't really return to Europe until, right, we're talking the late 1700s through the Baal Shem Tov. So that's kind of but if you want, I'll give you more details later when I'll continue our discussions later. Okay, and thank you, Ella. Anyone else?
Hi, can I ask a question? Basically, I heard that people which are not Jewish have a part of and they have a soul, but a part of it's missing, or they don't have an extra part of it that Jewish people have. Is that true?
Okay, so it does depend who you're learning from, and there are definitely teachings out there and teachers out there that would use certain aspects of Kabbalah to suggest that there is a difference between a Jewish soul and a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person with regard to their soul. I'm not of that opinion, and again, I'm not necessarily alone in that. There are teachings that do suggest that. I personally find that uncomfortable. And base my own personal approach that I explained before on a number of different teachings, mainly coming from another Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that suggests that everyone has a place in Olam Haba, irregardless of whether they are Jewish or not. The difference between someone who's Jewish and not Jewish is essentially the way that they are able to elevate their soul. The essence of the soul is the same. Someone who is born Jewish or converts to Judaism has a different method by which they are able to connect to God and elevate their soul. A Jewish person, someone who converts to Judaism, same thing, they're both Jewish, does that through the 613 mitzvot. And they are able to connect to God in that way. Someone who is not Jewish doesn't have to connect to God in that way. They have the 7 Noahide laws, basic concepts of morality, such as do not murder, do not steal, establish law courts and justice, do not be cruel to animals, and things like that. Both of those ways. One is able that no one, again, and Judaism isn't evangelical, and not someone who is not Jewish. Jews are compelled to should feel comfortable and happy that someone who is not Jewish should be able to live a moral life in that way and still be able to connect to God. And a Jewish person lives a moral life in a different way, but it doesn't mean that innately their souls are any different. And that's my interpretation, that's my opinion. I'm not alone in that, but there are those who do teach that a Jewish soul is imbued with something extra. I don't necessarily buy into that, but I accept that the teaching is out there. Hope that answers your question. Fabulous. Anyone else? Actually, anyone else? I'll tell you what, we've gone over, and I feel bad for people who have lives to live and things to do. Please feel free to message me. Thank you for those. I'm always happy to kind of continue these discussions. Again, it's a pleasure. It's lovely as always. I shall see you soon. Oh, I've just seen your comment. Sorry, I didn't see it. Okay, that's fascinating. We'll continue the conversation later.
Sorry, how many more weeks are we going on for?
There's 2 more weeks.
Oh, great.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.